we have a dwindling number of bottles from back 30 plus years ago when they distilled. And it was really delicious bourbon. And we want to try to bring that back as close as we possibly can and respect that mash bill.
So the distillery is 166 years old, the oldest distillery in Missouri and the oldest distillery west of the Mississippi, still located on its original site. So the distillery was established in 1856 by a man named Ben Holladay. 50 years before that, the site itself was discovered by Lewis and Clark, and they charted and discovered the limestone springs on the property. Ben Holladay himself was a serial entrepreneur. He settled in Weston at the young age of 16, and being from Kentucky, he knew that that would be a great source for bourbon.
And so we're wanting consistency, we're wanting that yeast to be happy. The limestone spring water does that. It has that calcium, it has those micronutrients that may not be present in the grain, and so it's beneficial and helpful for the overall fermentation process. All right, so the original still house here is still on site. It's a fun place to come into every day. You see this old historic place and you really remember everybody who's done this job previously. We have started with our historic mash bill. When doing that, bourbon, by law, has to be at least 51% corn. We're 73% corn on that, and so that's the historic thing. Everything beyond that 51% corn can be any other small grain. And so our historic one used rye. We have ledgers, documents, TTB records showing that exact percentage breakdown.
A lot of distilleries you'll find will cook all of their grains in one cooker, and we have a large cooker and a small cooker that we cook our grains separately and then combine them.
And really what we're trying to do is just respect those grains and bring out as much flavor as we possibly can from those secondary grains. Once we've cooked that product and let the fermentation start, we allow it to be open top, allow tourists to sample it on tours. You can dip your finger in this and try the mash and see what it tastes like at various stages of the process. And then the younger batch is over here. This is 24 hours in the process, and so the yeast will start, and it's going to start by reproducing more yeast cells. It's going to produce more of itself. And then once it has done that, it's going to start taking those sugars and converting them over to ethanol. We have to cool the yeast, otherwise it'll kill itself off by releasing all that extra heat. And so we do have cooling coils inside of this, maintaining the temperature. There's a sweet spot and a balancing point on that.
So during Prohibition, we actually had a special license from the government to produce for medicinal purposes. And then obviously when Prohibition ended, production ramped back up. And we distilled bourbon on site until 1985. The movement with bourbon itself kind of fell off. People were more interested in the lighter spirits, but knowing what it takes to make a bourbon and the age and the craft and everything that goes into it, I think people really have latched onto that.
So we're constantly mixing up and stirring up this 5,000 gallon batch. So our goal during the distillation process is to keep this at 120 proof, this one at 130 proof. That's one of those historic pieces that digging back and looking at the records and talking with people who worked here 30, 40 years ago, they brought up. We don't want to waste anything in this process, and so the same farmer that actually supplies our corn is local here, and he'll come in and pick up the spent mash, what comes out of the bottom of the distillation column. It begins and ends essentially at one farm here in the Weston area. Typically, you think of bourbon and you notice the color and you think of that, but it starts its life crystal clear. And so we put up these 2 glass cylinders, and that's just a way to show you what it looks like at this process. We're gonna write our lot number down on these barrels, 22D22. So it was barreled on April 22nd, 2022. And then at that point, over the course of the aging process, it's really gonna develop the flavor that you would expect. The color will come early, but the flavor takes time. And so that's where aging in our rick houses is advantageous. So they're gonna be sitting up there for 6 to 10 years. I don't think you expect to see this property, this facility in the Kansas City area. Rick houses, as far as I know, they're only in a couple states. This building was built in the 50s. On the first blend, 21% of the barrels for that blend came from this first floor. 79% came from the 5th floor. Each floor has its own sort of microclimate, and so as you get to the top of the building, it's going to be potentially 20 degrees warmer than it is here on the first floor. You can find the bottle on a shelf, and it may taste different the next time you get it, and each time we bottle that, it's going to be different and unique. Bottled in Bond was a way to ensure that the whiskey you were drinking wouldn't kill you. It was produced by a reputable distillery. It was produced in certain manners that would ensure that it wasn't tainted with methanol or cut down with any sort of tobacco spit or prune juice. It's kind of morphed into a little bit of a stamp of authenticity. With Bottled in Bond, it has to be produced by one distillery, aged at least 4 years. It has to be a product of one distillation season, and it has to be bottled at exactly 100 proof. So those things, it keeps you from buying outside product. You have to distill it here, you have to age it here, and you have to bottle it here. This is all a Missouri piece, this is all local, and what we're doing is all done on site.